Hi, this is Oliver Trimiew, Pastor Oliver Trimiew from New City Fellowship. I hope you're having a wonderful, happy Juneteenth celebration today. It's a good holiday, though not an official federal holiday. It is a holiday in the state of Texas and a few other states. If you want to learn a lot about this particular event and what is Juneteenth, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, but I can't tell you everything because I just don't have enough time to do that. I would encourage you to look at Henry Louis Gates Jr., his website of 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. You can find this on pbs.org, or you can go to Juneteenth.com and find out information there. I'm drawing on those sources to give this little talk to begin with. Well, what is Juneteenth? It was a day in which, back in 1865, on June the 19th, that Major General Gordon Granger came to, with some Union troops here, into the city of Galveston, Texas, with the news that the war had ended. You might think, well, people should have known that. Well, I'm sorry, they didn't have texts at that time. It takes a while for information to get around. The war had, in fact, ended on April 9th, 1865, 2 months earlier. Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee met at Appomattox, and Lee surrendered. The South lost. And we had to hold that thought for a minute here. That was technically the end of the war here. And yet these folks had not received that news there in Texas. There are all sorts of theories as to why people hadn't received that news, but we don't need to speculate ultimately about that. Granger came with the news that the slaves were now free. Those of you who are really aware know, of course, well, that's a little late, because 2.5 years ago, the then executive and president, Abraham Lincoln, had, in September 62, given an order to be enacted and made real January 1st, 1863. It was called the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation did not free all of the slaves in the country, but it did free, in theory at least, all of those slaves that were being held in the Confederate States, those states which were in rebellion and at war with the United States of America. That order should have ended it in fact, it should have freed the slaves because, in fact, Texas was one of those states that was at war. Yet that didn't happen during that time. And the war itself was not really finished during that time. It didn't end, of course, until 2 years later. So when the Major General Granger comes along and makes this announcement, people are either, as slaves, of course, extremely excited, joyful and jubilant, just as excited as they were in some parts of the country when they had heard about the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was a fabulous day. It's a day when we finally see slavery coming to an end here. Of course, if you were a master, it was a day of great consternation, a day of great concern. In fact, we know that some masters did not, in fact, get this news to their plantations. They wanted perhaps one more crop, one more harvest to be collected before they let the slaves go. We also know that there were a few places in Texas, folks who, though they had the news, they did not release their slaves and forced them to continue to work. We have testimony about this from a number of different historians who have looked at this particular period. So we know that was true, and yet we celebrate this day because, in fact, it was a day when slavery's end was very near. Actually, the radical Republicans who were in Congress voted to enact in December a change to the Constitution. It was the 13th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment officially ended slavery. And thereafter, starting in January, that action was supposed to be taking place, and bit by bit, over time, various cities in the South, including the nation's capital, got rid of slavery in this country. So it's a wonderful thing to rejoice in, to see a cancer come to an end in this country. Many historians view this in some ways as the beginnings of a rebirth of this country. I want to read to you just a portion of this General Order Number 3. It said, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States," that was Abraham Lincoln, but he was already deceased, "all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection hitherto existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer." Boy, wouldn't that have been a wonderful thing if it had, in fact, been true? And in a few places, it was. And now, in other words, black folk who had worked for nothing all of those years were now going to have to be paid. Imagine that, paid for work that you did. And so that arrangement was made, and the rest of this order talks about encouraging them from this major general to stay at home, stay on your plantations, and not to loiter, and not to come to Union camp meeting places here to seek refuge. Freed slaves, or runaway slaves often did this when Union soldiers came near to find protection and to help. This Union general said, please don't do that, stay at home. But here's the wonderful thing, and I think something we can learn from this. Black folk, not all the black folk did that. They actually took a moment to do to experience what real freedom was about, and so they left their plantations. There's a lot of things that we can learn from this whole experience for Juneteenth, and that is, in particular, something that black and brown people, and especially Native Americans, have known for hundreds of years. Government doesn't keep its promises sometimes. It breaks treaties. It ignores laws. It makes unjust and unrighteous laws. And even when it tries to change some of those laws for the good, some of those laws are ignored, forgotten, or blatantly violated. You cannot put your complete trust in an executive order, in a law of legislation, because it doesn't change the hearts of people here. And ultimately, we have learned that people simply lie, and they don't tell the truth, and they don't keep their promises. It's a hard lesson to learn, but we've been dealing with this for centuries. The other thing that we can learn from thinking about Juneteenth is the fact that black folk, when they heard the news that they were free, did something that we call scattering. They did, in fact, scatter, even when they didn't know where they were going to go. And one of the reasons why they scattered is because they wanted to find family. One of the first things that happened when black people were set free was to find their uncles and their daughters, their aunts, their uncles, their sisters, their brothers, people who had been stolen from them, sold out from them, taken from them in various forms and ways, and they wanted to find their kin. Black folk have always been interested in family and finding their kin, no matter what the media tries to say about black family life. This was one of their greatest concerns. So Though they were encouraged to stay on the plantation, many of them did not. They scattered, they left, and they tried to begin a new life and to find family again, to rebuild family. We can learn from this, trying to keep families, particularly black families, together, healthy, in good shape, both educationally, economically, health-wise. If anything, that we have learned through this pandemic is how broken our systems are systemically at this point in time and why they need to be fixed. Again, we don't trust in just the laws, ultimately. Our trust is in the Lord God. But that doesn't mean that we don't protest and vote and fight for righteous and just laws that will lead to the bringing together of Black life and family, so that we can all celebrate together as American citizens. And by the way, one of the great things that Juneteenth does is it encourages us to recognize that these slaves were citizens. That's what the 13th and 14th Amendment in particular said. They were citizens of this country. They were Americans here. And they had built this country just and had nothing to be ashamed of. And then there's one last thing I think we can learn, and that is in this era where we are hearing so much about death and dying and sadness and brokenness and mourning and lament, which we are experiencing and know this to be true. This is a great day and a great celebration to rejoice, to be thankful, to cook up some good food. That's what they did on Juneteenth. In 1866, they started these celebrations with great food, great clothes, parades, all sorts of celebration, not only in Texas, but in all sorts of parts of the South and the rest of the country. As bit by bit, this celebration began to pick up steam, and this holiday began to be known all over. So we celebrate life. Jesus said, "I've come that you might have life abundantly." We celebrate life. And while we recognize the pain and death and suffering that we are currently experiencing, we will push always for life and the joy of life and the celebration of life, which we experience on a day like Juneteenth. So have a great day. Cook up your greens and your mashed potatoes and your ribs and whatever else that you're going to do here today. Oh yeah, you have to have a red drink. A red drink is a Juneteenth celebration. Put on your best clothes and enjoy the day that the Lord has made. Thanks for listening.